That should have been her wedding. Not in the bitter, consuming way of a woman who could not let go. In the simple, factual way of a woman who knew the truth and had nowhere to put it. 11 months ago, she had been engaged to the man now standing at that altar. She had said yes in this family's drawing room, worn his ring through 2 seasons, and begun, quietly, practically, to build a life inside her own mind. Then he ended it. 14 months later, he married her sister. Georgia did not move, did not reach for her champagne, did not allow her eyes to linger on the dance floor long enough for anyone watching to count the seconds. And people were watching, with that particular mixture of pity and relief, reserved for disasters that happened to someone else. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her spine was straight. Her expression gave nothing to the room. Across the hall, the doors opened. A man stepped inside, late, unhurried, and stopped. Because in a room full of people performing joy, one woman was sitting completely, unnervingly still. He could not look away. Welcome to Velvet Duke Romance Library. Like and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Now, let's begin. He did not know why he crossed the room. That was the part that stayed with him afterward, that he had moved without deciding to, which was not something Edmund did. He was not a man who acted without intention. He had built an entire life on the discipline of knowing precisely why he did everything before he did it. And yet here he was, setting his untouched champagne on the tray of a passing footman and threading through the outer edges of a reception he had arrived at reluctantly, moving toward a woman he had never seen before, because something about the way she was sitting had made it impossible to remain where he was. She had not looked up. That itself was unusual. In any room Edmund entered, people looked. It was not a vanity he particularly enjoyed. It was simply the physics of a dukedom, the gravitational consequence of a title, and the reputation that had accumulated around it over years. People looked, they adjusted, they oriented. This woman had not moved at all. He reached her table and stopped. Up close she was. He registered this with the same dispassionate clarity he registered most things, extraordinarily beautiful. Not in the performed, candlelight-designed way of the women who had been angling for his attention all evening. Something quieter than that. Something that would have been visible in any light, in any room, under any circumstances. The kind of beauty that did not require the cooperation of its setting. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her champagne sat untouched beside her. Her eyes, grey-green, clear, and currently directed at a point somewhere near the middle distance, had not yet registered his presence. Edmund waited. 1 breath, 2, then she felt it. The way people always eventually feel the weight of being looked at. And her gaze came up to his face with a composure so swift and practiced, it told him everything he needed to know. She had not been daydreaming. She had been somewhere private and painful, and had just been required, in the space of half a second, to return. He held her gaze and said nothing for a moment. Then he extended his hand, palm up, unhurried, without preamble or apology. "Dance with me." Not a command, not quite a request. Something offered in the space between, with the quiet ease of a man who understood, instinctively, that the worst thing he could do to her right now was make her feel cornered. Georgia looked at his hand. A beat passed, then another. Her eyes moved from his outstretched palm to his face, measuring him with an intelligence that was entirely unimpressed by the gesture and entirely focused on the intention behind it. She was deciding something. He could see the calculation moving behind those gray-green eyes, precise and rapid. Then she placed her hand in his. She rose without assistance, without drama, spine straight, chin level. And Edmund felt the slight, involuntary adjustment that moved through her as she stood, as though the simple act of being upright and in motion had released something she had been holding in compression for hours. He said nothing as he led her toward the floor. There was nothing to say yet. He did not know her name, did not know her story, did not know what the specific quality of her stillness had meant, or why the sight of her untouched champagne had moved his feet before his mind had caught up. He only knew that when she placed her hand in his, something shifted. They reached the floor. He turned to face her. She met his gaze, not with flirtation, not with performance, but with a directness that was slightly startling, present, steady. The gaze of a woman who had decided to do this and intended to do it with her full attention. He brought her into hold and they began to move. She danced well, better than well. There was a quality to the way she followed him that went beyond training, beyond the mechanical proficiency of a woman raised in houses where dancing was taught alongside breathing. She followed without surrendering, moved with him without disappearing into the lead. It required a specific kind of quiet confidence, that precise resistance, and Edmund, who noticed things, found it considerably more interesting than he had anticipated. He did not speak, neither did she. The music wrapped around them, and the reception blazed on around them, and Edmund became gradually, uncomfortably aware that he was paying this woman a quality of attention that the situation did not technically warrant. The particular angle of her chin, the way her gloved hand rested in his, correct, composed, but not rigid, the way her eyes moved, once, to the center of the floor, just briefly, just for a fraction of a second, and then moved deliberately, effortfully, away, there. He did not understand it yet, but that single redirected glance, controlled at considerable cost, told him that the stillness at the edge of this reception hall was not accidental. Something in this room had put it there. Something in this room was the reason her champagne had sat untouched from the moment it was poured. The music continued its first long measure into a second, and Edmund felt, in the shifting quality of the room's attention, that they had been noticed, eyes moving toward them, the particular alertness of an audience that has located something more interesting than the official spectacle. Georgia felt it too. The faint tension that moved through her hand, through the line of her shoulders, told him she had expected it, perhaps dreaded it. He adjusted his hand at her back, barely, fractionally, a steadying pressure that announced nothing to the room and said everything to her. She did not look at him, but the tension in her shoulders eased, just slightly, just enough. The song ended. Georgia stepped back, with the practiced grace of a woman returning from somewhere she had not particularly wanted to go, and then the groom's mother was there. She materialized the way women of her particular breed always did, at precisely the wrong moment, with precisely the right smile, perfumed, positioned, her eyes doing something entirely different from her mouth. She took both of Georgia's gloved hands before Georgia could prevent it. "My dear Georgia," the elaborate warmth of someone performing tenderness for an audience already identified and located. "How extraordinarily brave you are. Cecily is so grateful you came. We all are. Truly, every word a blade. Brave, grateful you came." Each one a quiet public reminder of exactly what Georgia was sitting through, delivered with a smile so warm that objecting would have made Georgia appear ungracious. "It is my sister's wedding." Georgia's voice was perfectly even. "There was never any question of my coming." The woman's smile widened, something satisfied sharpening inside it. She patted Georgia's hands once, and then her gaze moved to Edmund, with a recalibrating interest that was almost audible. "Your Grace." Immediately warmer. "We are so honored." Edmund inclined his head, with the exact minimum the moment required. Not a syllable more. She held her position 3 seconds longer than necessary, long enough to ensure the exchange had been observed, then moved away with the unhurried satisfaction of a woman who had accomplished what she came to do. Edmund watched her go, then turned back to Georgia. She had already rebuilt. Every wall, every arranged angle of her expression, reconstructed in 10 seconds, with a speed that was, under these circumstances, quietly devastating to witness. Chin level, hands folded, looking at a point past his left shoulder, as though the dance had not happened at all. He had been in enough rooms to know what had just occurred. The older woman's performance had been exquisitely calibrated, public enough to be observed, warm enough to be undeniable, pointed enough to draw blood through silk. Georgia had absorbed every syllable without flinching, without surrendering a single thing to the watching room. What it had cost her was visible only in the faint tension at her jaw, and in the champagne, still untouched. Another dance. Georgia's gaze returned to him, guarded, rapidly recalibrating. She told him quietly what a second dance would mean in this room tonight, extending him the courtesy of understanding it before he committed. Edmund held her gaze. "I know." Something moved through her expression, not warmth yet, but the first faint revision of a conclusion she had already begun drawing about him. She extended her hand. They returned to the floor. The room did exactly what Georgia had predicted, registered them, assessed them, set its quiet machinery of speculation into motion. Edmund felt it the way he always felt such things. Background weather, largely irrelevant. Georgia felt it differently. The fractional reinforcement of her posture told him so. One more layer of composure added to a structure already bearing considerable weight. He drew her marginally closer, a deliberate adjustment that gave the room something concrete to occupy itself with, instead of Georgia's history. He felt her register it, a barely perceptible catch in her breath, quickly controlled. "You are using me as a shield." Low, steady, without accusation, which made it land with more weight than accusation would have. "I am," without apology. Then, with a dry precision he had not expected, "At least you admit it." It seemed more respectful than pretending I had simply forgotten where the floor ended. Something crossed her face, not quite a smile, the ghost of the impulse before she caught and redirected it. But it had been there. Edmund registered it with the quiet attention of a man who had decided he would very much like to see it completed. The music continued. The room watched. Georgia held herself together with everything she had. Then from the corner of his eye, movement. Arthur Calloway had been occupied with well-wishers near the far end of the room. Then something drew his gaze toward the floor. Edmund watched the man's eyes move across the dancers, the automatic sweep of a new husband accounting for his reception, and stop. It took Calloway a moment, one telling moment of stillness, to identify the woman in Edmund's arms, the sage-green gown, the chestnut hair, the profile he clearly knew. Not grief, not longing, something colder, the recalibrating awareness of a man who had made an assessment long ago and was only now, in this particular light, beginning to question it. Edmund returned his attention to Georgia. She had not seen it. She was looking past his shoulder with the focused composure of a woman managing her own interior weather, entirely unaware that across the room the man who had discarded her was standing very still, watching a duke hold her like she was worth the trouble. The second song wound toward its close, and Edmund, who had entered this reception with no intention beyond fulfilling a social obligation and leaving at the earliest acceptable hour, understood with quiet, inconvenient certainty that he was not going anywhere. Not yet. Not until he knew her name. Not until he understood what this evening had cost her. The question had settled into him the way questions do when they have no intention of leaving. The music did not stop. It simply shifted, one composition dissolving into the next with the seamless continuity of a well-rehearsed orchestra. The transition was barely perceptible, a breath between phrases, a new key settling into place. Neither of them moved to leave the floor. Georgia noticed first, a slight lift of her gaze toward the musicians, then back to him. The unspoken observation moved between them with the clarity of two people who had, without discussing it, arrived at the same awareness simultaneously. They were staying. The third dance was different, the social lacquer thinner, the silences heavier, the performance of it increasingly indistinguishable from the thing itself. The room had returned to its own business, which made everything feel paradoxically more private. George's hand had settled into his, with less deliberateness than the first dance, less conscious arrangement. Edmund noticed it the way he noticed most things, quietly, without drawing attention to the noticing. He gave it 2 full measures before he spoke. If you could be anywhere in England right now, where would it be? George's eyes came to his face with the startled quality of someone who had assembled a full defensive architecture and found the approach arriving from a completely unexpected direction. That is not what people ask at weddings. No. His voice remained low. They ask how you are, which is considerably less honest. Something moved through her expression. Not quite amusement, the cousin of it. He did not press. He had learned across 3 dances that Georgia did not respond to pressure. Precision required space. The best way to get anything real from her was to leave the door open and wait. Somewhere behind her the bride laughed, that bright carrying laugh punctuating the evening at intervals. Edmund watched Georgia absorb it, watched the fractional tightening move through her features, quickly smoothed, watched her redirect her gaze to a point past his shoulder and hold it there with a steadiness that cost her something. He said nothing, simply maintained the dance and let the moment be what it was. When she looked back, something had shifted, not softened, recalibrated, as though she had anticipated a response and was quietly revising her assessment of him for not having given one. Northumberland, she said it simply. There is a house there, my grandmother's. The library is still intact, and the grounds go on longer than you can see from the upper windows. A pause. No one would be watching me there. The last sentence arrived without self-pity. Just fact, delivered clean. The way she delivered most things when her guard slipped far enough to allow it. Edmund looked at her, not with the measured assessing look of the last hour. Something quieter, something that had stopped calculating and was simply paying attention. Why did you tell me that? Georgia blinked. One unguarded blink, the first genuinely undefended thing she had done all evening. I don't know. Quiet, unpolished, entirely unplanned. The honest answer of a woman who had not intended to be honest, offered to a man she had known for the length of 3 dances and could not yet explain to herself. Edmund did not press the advantage of it. He held her gaze and let the moment exist without requiring it to become something else. The music began its final phrase, the long, resolving descent, before releasing its audience back to champagne and conversation. The last note landed. They stilled. He released her waist. Her hand remained in his a half-breath longer than the dance required, not through intention, but through the small, honest delay of a body that had momentarily forgotten to perform. Then she drew it back. I don't know your name, he said it simply, a fact that had become, over the last 20 minutes, increasingly inconvenient. Georgia looked at him steadily. Around them, the floor shifted as couples dispersed, and the room reabsorbed them both into its ordinary motion. No, she said. She held his gaze one moment longer, something in it that was not quite an invitation and not quite a refusal, occupying the precise charged territory between the two, and turned toward her table. Her champagne was still there, still untouched. He watched her go, back straight, chin level, and understood with quiet certainty that he was not finished. He did not know her name. He did not know her story. But before this evening ended, both of those things were going to change. He did not follow her immediately. He gave her time to reach her table, to settle, to reassemble whatever interior arrangement she required. Edmund understood the value of space, and he understood that a woman who had spent the entire evening managing the precise distance between herself and everything dangerous was not going to respond well to being pursued across a reception hall. So he waited. He accepted a fresh glass of champagne from a passing footman, exchanged a brief obligatory word with a man whose company he did not want. kept Georgia in his peripheral vision with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to monitoring a room without appearing to monitor anything at all. Then he crossed to her table. She looked up as he approached, no surprise in it. She had been aware of him the entire time. He set his champagne beside her untouched glass and remained standing, not looming, simply present, giving her the option of the conversation without forcing it. A beat passed. "Georgia," she offered it cleanly, without preamble, the precise minimum of ceremony the moment required. Edmund looked at her. "Georgia," he said it once, quietly, as though placing it somewhere specific inside himself, rather than simply repeating it. Something moved through her expression, the faint, involuntary response of a person who had expected their name to land as information and found it landing as something else entirely. Before either of them could continue, a voice cut across the space between them. "Georgia, darling!" Her mother, arriving with the particular brightness of a woman who had been managing appearances all evening and had just located a new variable requiring immediate assessment. Her eyes moved to Edmund in approximately 1 second and arrived at a conclusion that made her smile broaden considerably. "You must come and speak with the Hartfield cousins." Georgia rose smoothly, but Edmund caught the faint tightening at the corner of her mouth that her mother, angled slightly wrong, did not. "Excuse me." She met his gaze for one brief level moment, something in it that was not quite apology, and followed her mother into the crowd. Edmund watched her go. Then he located his host. Viscount Pembroke was exactly where men of his disposition always were at their own receptions, near the good wine, slightly removed from the dancing. He welcomed Edmund's approach with uncomplicated pleasure. They spoke of inconsequential things for 4 minutes. Then Edmund said, with carefully weighted casualness, "The young woman in the sage green gown, sitting alone near the east wall when I arrived. Do you know her?" Pembroke's expression shifted, the almost imperceptible adjustment of a man deciding how much of a thing to say. "Miss Georgia Sutton," he said, "the bride's elder sister." Edmund waited. There was more. "She was engaged to Calloway," Pembroke continued, his voice lowering without being asked. 7 months. Then Calloway ended it. A pause. 14 months later, he married the younger one. The reception blazed around them, champagne circulating, laughter rising and falling, the orchestra bright and indifferent. Edmund was very still. She watched the whole of it from inside the family home. Pembroke said quietly, "The announcement, the engagement party, the dress fittings, all of it." He swirled his wine. "She has not said a word publicly. Not once." Edmund looked across the room to where Georgia had been absorbed back into the crowd, visible only as a flash of sage green between darker evening coats. Her back was to him. Her posture, impeccable. Of course it was. He thought about the untouched champagne, the folded hands, 3 dances worth of composure, maintained at a cost he was only now beginning to calculate. He thought about no one would be watching me there, the specific relief of it, the exhaustion underneath, and understood it now with a clarity that reordered everything. She had not been sitting at the edge of the room because she was overlooked. She had been sitting there because it was the only position in the entire hall from which she could survive the evening. The crowd shifted, and Georgia appeared through the gap, moving back toward her table, her eyes already finding his across the distance with a directness that told him she had known he would still be exactly where she had left him. She stopped, looked at him, and in 2 seconds, watching his face with that precise, intelligent attention, she understood. Her chin lifted, the specific adjustment of a woman who has just realized she has been discussed and is deciding how to carry that with dignity. "You know," not a question, delivered with perfect evenness. And underneath it, barely perceptible, the anticipation of yet another person looking at her, with that unbearable mixture of pity and careful handling. Edmund held her gaze and said nothing for a moment, that lasted precisely long enough to be deliberate, because what crossed his face in that silence was not pity, and Georgia, who had become expert at reading exactly what people felt about her situation, found that she could not immediately name what she saw. That single unprecedented failure of her own careful system unsettled her more than anything else that had happened all evening. "I knew," Edmund said, "before I crossed the room." Georgia's brow shifted, barely. "You could not have. You arrived after the reception began. You did not know who I was. I did not know your name, or your connection to the bride." He held her gaze steadily. "But I knew something had put you at the edge of that room, with untouched champagne, and your hands folded, like you were holding yourself together by will. I simply did not know what it was." Georgia said nothing. "And now that you do know," she said finally, "what is it you feel you ought to do about it? Not bitter, not sharp." The question of a woman who had received enough performances of concern to become deeply skeptical of the genuine article. Edmund pulled out the chair across from her and sat, unhurried, as though the decision had been made some time ago. He rested one arm on the table, met her eyes. "Nothing. I don't feel I ought to do anything about it." Georgia blinked. One small, unguarded blink. "What I observed before I knew," he continued, "was a woman holding herself together with more dignity than anyone in this room deserves to witness. Knowing the rest does not change that observation. It simply explains it." Georgia sat with what he had said without immediately responding, which he was beginning to understand was her version of being genuinely affected. "People have been very kind," she said at last, "about the situation. I imagine they have. Kindness is considerably easier than honesty, and considerably less useful." Something moved through her expression. Not amusement, recognition. The look of a person who has thought the same thing many times and never expected to hear it said aloud. "What would you consider useful?" she asked, "in a situation like mine?" "I have no idea." The directness surprised her visibly. "I have never sat through the wedding of the person who should have married me while the room watched to see if I would fracture. I suspect very little is useful, and that being told so is marginally preferable to being told everything happens for a reason." Georgia looked at him, then away, toward the dancing, toward the blazing center of the evening where Cecily was laughing at something Arthur had said. "She did not set out to hurt me. Quiet, careful." The sentence of a woman who had worked very hard to arrive at it. "Cecily is not cruel. She is simply someone who wanted something and did not consider the cost carefully enough." "And Arthur," she stopped. Her hands shifted in her lap. The first uncontrolled movement he had seen from her, quickly stilled. "Arthur made a choice," she said. "The difficulty is not the choice itself. The difficulty is," she stopped again, "working towards something, not performing the effort, actually arriving at something she had not yet articulated even to herself. I had already begun to imagine the life," she said finally, not foolishly. "I had simply, in a very practical way, begun to inhabit a future, and then the future was revised, inside my own family, which meant there was nowhere to put any of it. No clean distance, no room in which to simply be without it." She stopped, looked at him. Edmund could see she had said considerably more than she intended. To a man she had known for 3 dances and 1 unguarded conversation, he did not move, did not speak immediately, simply looked at her, without pity, without managed warmth, and let the silence hold what she had said without requiring it to become smaller. That is the most honest thing anyone has said at this reception. Something shifted in her expression, a small, careful revision of something she had been certain about. "You are not," she said slowly, "what I expected." "What did you expect? Someone who would tell me that time is a great healer. Time simply passes," Edmund said. "What people do inside it is their own business." The corner of her mouth moved. Almost. Georgia's mother materialized, having clearly monitored this corner of the room long enough. Her eyes went immediately to Edmund, arriving at conclusions with impressive speed. "Georgia, darling, Lady Hartfield is asking for you." Georgia began to rise. Edmund rose with her, and before she could step away, "Miss Sutton, might I call on you tomorrow?" Her mother's intake of breath was audible. Georgia went still, looking at the table rather than at him. The response of a person who has been asked something they wanted to be asked, and is not yet certain whether wanting it is safe. She looked up. "Why?" One word. The honest question of a woman who needed an honest answer before giving anything further. Edmund held her gaze, and what he said in the quiet space that followed was not what she had expected, was not what anyone had offered her in 11 months of careful sympathy. It was so direct and so unornamented that Georgia stood at her sister's wedding reception and felt for the first time since Arthur Calloway had walked out and taken her future with him, something shift in the careful architecture of her recovery, something small, something quiet, something she would spend the hours that followed trying to convince herself she had imagined. He came at 11, not the fashionable hour, but 11 in the morning, when the light was still thin and the frost had not yet released the garden, and Georgia had not finished convincing herself that last night had been less significant than it felt. His card arrived at the door 40 seconds before he did. Georgia was in the sitting room with a book she had not been reading when her mother appeared with the card held between 2 fingers and an expression of barely contained significance that was, in its own way, more exhausting than the wedding had been. "I will receive him in the drawing room." She set down her unread book, alone. Her mother withdrew with the energy of a woman choosing her battles and rescheduling them for later. Edmund was standing at the window when she entered, not examining the room, not performing the inspection of a morning caller familiarizing himself with his surroundings, simply standing, looking out at the frost-silvered garden with his hands clasped behind his back. He did not fill silence with movement. He simply occupied it. He turned when she entered. His eyes moved over her face, the gaze of a man checking that the person he had come to see was, in plain morning light, still the person he remembered. Apparently she was. Something settled in his expression. They sat. A footman appeared with tea neither of them had requested and both ignored. Georgia folded her hands in her lap, then, catching herself in the familiar gesture, deliberately unfolded them. Edmund noticed, said nothing. "I had not expected you quite so early. I considered waiting until the proper hour," he returned, and then decided that was a great deal of effort in service of a convention neither of us particularly requires. "You presume quite a lot for a man I have known since yesterday evening, perhaps." He held her gaze without apology. "Is it an inaccurate presumption?" She considered lying, decided against it. "No, it is not." He looked toward the window. "Would you walk with me? It is very cold." "Yes." A pause. "But it is also not this room." She found herself standing before she had made a conscious decision to stand. "I will get my coat." They went out through the side door, breath visible in the cold air, frost crunching underfoot. The sky the pale gray of a winter morning that cannot decide whether it intends to clear. Georgia's mother watched from the upstairs window and chose for once to let the thing breathe. They walked in silence for the first minute, not uncomfortable silence, the kind with its own companionable weight that does not require filling. "Tell me what you read," Edmund said. "I beg your pardon?" "Last night you mentioned your grandmother's library. That tells me you have opinions about books," Georgia answered before her usual caution could intercept it. "History, mostly. Natural philosophy. Some fiction, though I am particular about it. I find most novels written for women deeply insulting to women." "In what sense?" "In the sense that they assume the primary ambition of any woman with a functioning mind is to secure a husband and then cease to have one." "A functioning mind," Edmund said carefully. "Or any opinions about what happens after the securing?" "Both. Frequently both." They turned at the far end of the path, and began the slow circuit back. "What do you find tiresome about the season?" "The assumption," Georgia said without hesitation, "that every room I walk into requires me to be performing something. And are you? Right now?" She considered it genuinely. "Less than usual." "Good." Georgia became gradually aware that she had not thought about the wedding once in the last 20 minutes. Not about Cecily or Arthur or the room full of watching eyes. She had been thinking about what she read, about the mild, bracing pleasure of being asked questions that expected real answers. The realization settled into the morning quietly, like the light, thin, pale, and surprisingly warm for the season. They reached the side door. Edmund stopped and turned, and Georgia realized they were standing closer than the path had required. The careful distance of a morning call, quietly abandoned by both of them without announcement. She did not step back. He looked at her in that way she was beginning to recognize, without the intermediary of social calculation. Then, "I have attended a great many weddings, Miss Sutton." Georgia waited. "I have never," he said, crossed the room. He held her gaze long enough for the weight of it to be unmistakable. Then he inclined his head, turned, and walked back toward his carriage. Georgia stood at the door, her hand on the frame. Without having noticed, she placed it there. Edmund's words settled into the quiet of the morning, with the irreversible quality of things that cannot be unheard. She went inside, stood in the entrance hall a long moment, then went upstairs, past her mother's pointed expression without stopping, and watched his carriage from the window until it had entirely disappeared. That evening, when the house had grown quiet, a note arrived on a silver tray. The handwriting on the outside was precise and unhurried, the hand of someone who did not second-guess what they set down. She turned it over, broke the seal. It was not from Edmund. The handwriting inside was smaller, softer, more familiar than she had wanted to see tonight. Cecily's handwriting, 4 lines requesting a private meeting, tomorrow, alone, at the new townhouse on Belgrave Street. Georgia set the note on the windowsill and looked at it for a long time, at her sister's careful loops, the polite phrasing, and felt the quiet, complicated weight of everything the evening had, briefly, mercifully, allowed her to forget. Belgrave Street was exactly what Georgia had expected. The townhouse was new, recently furnished, filled with bright, expensive evidence of a life beginning exactly as designed. Fresh paint, good curtains, flowers in rooms that had not yet accumulated the warmth that turns a house into a home. It smelled of newness and intention, and the faint note of someone trying very hard. Cecily was already in the morning room, pale blue dress, hair arranged with careful artlessness, beautiful. She had always been beautiful. Georgia had never begrudged her that, had never begrudged her most things, because Cecily's wants had always arrived wrapped in such genuine warmth that resenting them felt like resenting sunlight. Until 14 months ago, Georgia. Cecily took both her hands. Her eyes were searching. "I am glad you came. You asked me to." Pleasantly, without inflection, they sat by the fireplace. Tea appeared. The maid disappeared. The fire settled with a soft domestic sound, while both women arranged themselves for whatever this was going to be. "I wanted to speak with you about the Duke of Harwick." Georgia lifted her tea, sipped it, set it back with a steadiness she had not been entirely certain she possessed. "People noticed," Cecily continued. 3 dances, and then sitting together for quite some time. A pause. "Edmund of Harwick has had every eligible woman in London presented to him for 3 seasons and shown sustained interest in none of them. Or," Georgia said, "he has simply not found what he was looking for. I want you to be careful. You are warning me against a man whose primary offense appears to be that he paid me attention." Georgia kept her voice even. "I find I am having difficulty locating the threat." Cecily set down her cup. Her hands were not entirely steady. "I am not warning you against him. I am asking you to be careful. There is a difference." "Is there?" The fire shifted. Outside, Belgrave Street conducted itself with complete indifference to the two women by the fireplace. Georgia looked at her sister, at the hands not quite steady, at the room trying slightly too hard to be a home, at the eyes searching her face with something that had started as concern and was beginning, under Georgia's level attention, to reveal its actual composition. It was not concern, it was fear, the specific private fear of a woman who had won a man under complicated circumstances and found, in the quiet of her bright new rooms, that winning was not the same thing as being chosen. Georgia felt no triumph in understanding it, only tired compassion for all the ways people hurt each other sideways, simply by wanting what they wanted without looking at the cost. I am not the person in this room who needs to be careful. Cecily went still, the stillness of a person who has heard something true and is deciding whether to admit it. Georgia rose, set her cup on the tray. Thank you for the tea. She meant it. She left. Outside, the cold air hit her face, and she walked, not toward home, but simply walked. By the corner, she had arrived at a conclusion. Cecily's warning had told her something, not about Edmund, but about herself, about the part of her that had been sitting with his absence since yesterday morning, turning his words over with the attention of a woman who has tried to stop thinking about something and cannot. The warning had not made her cautious, it had made her certain, which was considerably more frightening. That evening, she dressed for Lady Fentworth's musicale with more care than she had given anything in recent memory, and spent considerable time pretending this had nothing to do with anything in particular. The drawing room was candlelit and full, gilded chairs, a quartet preparing at the raised platform. Georgia found a seat near the center, arranged her program, and settled. Then felt it. Not a sound, not a movement she could identify. A shift in her own awareness, subtle as a change in air pressure before weather, moving through her before she had located its source. She waited 3 full seconds, then turned. Edmund was at the entrance, speaking to Lord Fentworth. His attention appeared entirely occupied, and then it was not. His gaze moved across the room, not searching, not gradual, with the unhesitating certainty of a man who already knows where he is going. It found her in under a second. He said something brief to Fentworth, inclined his head, and began to move. He did not look like a man crossing a room out of social obligation. He looked like a man crossing a room because there was only one place in it he had any intention of being. The directness of it moved through Georgia, with a warmth she had not felt in so long that for a moment she did not recognize it. Then she did, and recognizing it frightened her considerably more than not knowing what it was. He took the seat beside her, not directly adjacent, but close enough that when the quartet began and the room settled into attentive quiet, the social distance between them felt considerably smaller than it appeared. Edmund read his program with the unhurried attention of a man genuinely interested in what the quartet intended to play. Georgia found this, irrationally, slightly irritating. Then the music began. Haydn, clean, precise, emotionally intelligent. The room leaned into it. In the warm amber candlelight, winter pressing dark against the windows, the evening took on a quality that was almost unbearably civilized. Edmund leaned slightly toward her. You look as though you arrived at a conclusion today that you have not yet decided what to do with. Georgia kept her eyes on the quartet. You have known me 36 hours. You cannot possibly read my expression with any reliability. I read it quite reliably at the wedding, and yesterday in the garden. A pause. You saw your sister today. Georgia's eyes moved to him involuntarily. A brief, sharp glance she could not prevent. How did you know that? Because you arrived this evening with the composure of someone who has absorbed something uncomfortable and spent several hours deciding what it means. Different from the reception. That one was braced. This one is quieter. A beat, as though you made a decision. She felt the slightly vertiginous awareness of being seen accurately by someone who had not been given enough information to be accurate. She warned me to be careful. Of me. Of you. Edmund absorbed this. The quartet moved into the second movement, something more lyrical, the melody rising and falling with patient inevitability. And what did you tell her? Very little. She told me considerably more than she intended. A pause. She is not certain she has what she thinks she has. Does that give you any satisfaction? Georgia considered it honestly. No, I thought it might. It doesn't. She was quiet a moment. Anger has a season. Mine has mostly passed. What is left is simply the shape it left. Edmund was quiet. The music filled the space between them. My father died when I was 19. Georgia looked at him. He was not a good man. His voice remained even, but something behind it had set the social surface entirely aside. Not cruel, simply absent, systematically, in every way that mattered. When he died, I discovered I was not grieving the man. I was grieving the father I had spent 19 years constructing in the space where he should have been. Georgia said nothing. The real loss, he continued, was not a person. It was an imagined future with someone who had never existed outside my own construction of him. And there was nowhere to put that. It was not the kind of grief anyone provides arrangements for. He stopped, looked at the quartet with an expression that was, for the first time in Georgia's experience of him, entirely unguarded. The precision she had come to read as characteristic had set itself aside, and what was underneath was simply a man who had carried something for a long time and had just, without fully planning to, set it down in front of another person. That is exactly it. Quiet, certain. The voice of a woman who has been trying to explain something for 11 months and has just heard it articulated with a precision she could not have managed herself. The future, she said, the imagined one, the version of myself I had already begun to inhabit. That is what was taken, not Arthur. Arthur was only the mechanism of the loss. The loss itself was the life I had already started living inside my own mind, with nowhere to grieve it publicly, nowhere to put it where anyone would recognize what it was. She stopped, looked down at her gloved hands in her lap. Edmund's hand rested on his knee. It moved, barely, fractionally. His gloved fingers came to rest at the edge of hers, not covering her hand, not grasping it, simply present, the lightest possible contact, the kind that could be denied if denial became necessary. Neither of them looked down. The candlelight moved in the warm air. Georgia sat very still with the edge of Edmund's hand against hers and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not happiness, not relief. Something more structural than either. Like the first solid ground she had stood on in almost a year. Neither of them moved their hand. Then Lord Ashby dropped cheerfully into the vacant chair between them, greeted Georgia with genuine pleasure, and began telling her something about a mutual acquaintance, with no awareness whatsoever that he had just walked into the middle of something. Georgia answered him pleasantly. Edmund's hand returned to his own knee. She waited until Lord Ashby's attention shifted, then glanced sideways. Edmund was looking at the quartet platform. His jaw was set with the controlled tension she recognized, the contained expression of a man exercising considerable restraint over something he would prefer to express differently. He looked like a man who had run entirely out of patience with everything in the room that was not her. After the final note and the room's applause, Edmund was at her side before Lord Ashby could reclaim her attention. The terrace, low, just for her. "There is something I would like to say without an audience." Georgia looked at him, then set her program on her chair and walked with him toward the terrace doors. The night air outside was sharp and cold, clarifying, like truth cutting through performance. Edmund turned to face her at the stone balustrade. The candlelight from inside fell across his features at an angle that left half his face in shadow. He looked at her, and the expression she found was stripped of its social lacquer, stripped of everything except what had been underneath it all along. Georgia stood in the cold dark and understood, with a certainty that moved through her like the night air, that whatever he was about to say was going to change the careful shape of everything she had decided to feel about him. He told her on the terrace, not with the formality of a declaration, simply the truth, offered plainly in the cold dark outside Lady Fentworth's drawing room, that he had not come to the musicale for the music, that the 36 hours since the reception had been occupied, to a degree he found slightly inconvenient, by the question of her, not her circumstances, her, the mind of her, the precision of her attention when she was not performing composure, and when she was, that he was not offering sympathy dressed in evening clothes. Georgia listened without interrupting, without the defensive architecture she had maintained for 11 months. When he finished, she looked at him for a long moment, in the cold dark. "I believe you." 3 words, from a woman who did not say things she did not mean. Something moved across Edmund's face before his composure recovered it. She was beginning to understand that the things he allowed briefly across his face, before recovering them, were the truest things about him. 2 days later, his note arrived. The Harwick Library. Thursday at 2. I believe you mentioned an interest in intact collections. E. She read it twice, set it down, read it a third time, wrote her acceptance with a speed she chose not to examine too closely. She brought her aunt. Mrs. Aldwell was 61, sharp-minded, genuinely fond of books, and constitutionally incapable of maintaining suspicion in the presence of a good first edition. Georgia had selected her with care. Harwick House announced itself from the end of the drive, with the quiet, settled authority of a house that had been exactly what it was for a very long time. Stone the color of winter sky, tall windows, proportions that were simply, unargumentatively correct. Edmund received them in the entrance hall. He greeted Mrs. Aldwell with a courtesy so genuine and specific, he had located that she had a particular interest in botanical illustration, that the older woman was completely won over within 90 seconds. Georgia watched this with a mixture of admiration and mild exasperation. The library was at the end of the east wing. Edmund opened the doors and stood aside. Georgia walked in and stopped. Floor to ceiling on 4 walls, shelves of dark walnut deepened over decades into something close to black. Volumes arranged with the care of someone who actually read them. Tall, narrow windows admitting winter light in long, pale columns across reading tables and Turkish rugs. The irreplaceable smell of a room filled with books for a very long time. Your grandmother's, would it compare? Nothing would compare to this. Something in his expression told her the response had mattered to him. Not for vanity, but for the reason a person is glad when something they value is valued by someone they are beginning to trust. Edmund positioned a footman in the adjoining room with a writing desk, should she wish to make notes. Mrs. Aldwell wished to make notes. The footman withdrew discreetly into the far corner of the adjoining room and became, in the practiced way of well-trained household staff, effectively invisible. The connecting door remained open, propriety intact, presence effectively absent. Georgia moved along the nearest wall, reading spines, touching the occasional volume with unconscious reverence. Edmund moved with her, simply present, occasionally reaching above her for something on a higher shelf and passing it down without comment. It was comfortable. That was what surprised her most. Moving through this room with this man, without performance, without the careful management of impression that had characterized every social interaction for 11 months. She paused at the natural philosophy section. You have read these? Most of them. Some twice. He reached past her, close enough that she felt his warmth before registering the proximity, and drew out a volume of Herschel. Georgia opened it, found handwriting in the margin, small, dark, precise. A question posed to the text, a mind that did not receive information passively, but interrogated it. She turned pages, found more notes, and more. She closed the book, looked at him. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen before, not the controlled attention of the reception, or the musicale, something quieter. The expression of a man who has shown someone something private and is waiting, with genuine uncertainty, to discover whether it was a mistake. Georgia set the Herschel on the reading table and found she had nothing adequate to say, so she said nothing. Edmund looked at her, and whatever he found in her expression moved something in his. He reached up slowly and drew a strand of hair from her cheek. His fingers barely grazed her skin. The contact lasted less than a second. He did not step back. Winter light fell between them in its long, pale column. In the adjoining room, Mrs. Aldwell turned a page. The house settled with the deep, unhurried quiet of old stone. Georgia looked back at him and made the decision the way you make decisions that have been waiting longer than you have admitted. She closed the remaining distance. His hand came to her waist, not swiftly, the way a man reaches for something he has been waiting to reach for and intends, now that the waiting is over, to be entirely present for. She felt the warmth of it through the silk of her gown, certain, as though the hand had always intended to be exactly there. The kiss was not impulsive. It was chosen, by both of them, with full awareness, in the winter light of a library that smelled of old paper and careful thought. His mouth found hers with a patience that undid her more thoroughly than urgency could have. George's hand moved to his lapel without instruction, curling slightly into the fabric of his coat. He kissed her the way he did everything, with complete, considered attention, as though she were the only thing in the room that required it. It deepened, with the natural, unhurried deepening of two people who have arrived somewhere they both intended to arrive. His hand drew her marginally closer. She let it. In the adjoining room, Mrs. Aldwell turned another page. The sound arrived at Georgia from a very great distance. When she drew back, not in retreat, but to look at him, his expression was open in a way she had not seen before, unguarded, the surface precision set entirely aside. What was underneath was simply a man looking at her with an attention that had nothing managed about it. She stepped back, reached for her gloves. "Don't make this into something," he said quietly, "that you decide was a mistake by morning." Georgia pulled on the second glove, smoothed it at the wrist, picked up her coat, moved toward the adjoining room. At the threshold she stopped, did not turn fully, only enough. "I have not yet decided what it was," and went through the door. Edmund stood alone in the library, in the winter light and the smell of old paper. He looked at the reading table where she had set the Herschel volume, where her gloves had rested. He had seen it from the threshold. Her hands, not entirely steady at the coat fastening as she left. That single, unguarded evidence of what she was carrying out of this room settled into him with a warmth and a quiet, irrevocable sense of consequence he was fairly certain was going to stay with him for a very long time. She did not sleep, not from regret, from something else entirely, something that kept her at her bedroom window long after the house had gone quiet, watching frost reform on the garden below, turning the evening over with the careful attention she gave to things that mattered. She had not made a mistake. She had expected, in the hours after leaving Harwick House, to find the familiar machinery of self-protection assembling itself. The doubts, the careful dismantling, the retreat into the composed, defended version of herself that had kept her upright through 11 months of impossible performance. Instead, she found nothing of the kind. What she found was something she had almost forgotten the texture of. Not happiness, something more durable. The quiet sensation of having moved in the right direction. The doubt, when it arrived, was not about Edmund. It was about herself, about whether she was brave enough to want this without apology, without the elaborate interior negotiations she had been conducting since Arthur Calloway revised her future without her permission. She sat with it until the moon had moved entirely across the window. Then she made her decision. She went to her writing desk. 4 words. The East Garden. 10 o'clock. No signature. He would know. She sealed it, left it on the hall tray, went to bed and slept, for the first time in days, with the complete depth of a woman who has made up her mind. Edmund arrived at 9:55. Georgia heard the crunch of his boots on the frost from the garden gate, unhurried, the tread of a man who already knew what he intended to say. She had been there since 9:40. She stood at the center of the east garden in her sage-green coat, breath visible in the cold air, frost-pale grass stiff underfoot, bare branches sketched against a sky the color of old pewter. No audience, no room full of people measuring her composure, just the cold air and Edmund coming through the gate. He stopped, looked at her with that direct, unhurried attention, taking in the coat, the gloves, the visible breath, and waited, because she had called this meeting and he understood she needed to speak first.
"I need you to understand something."
Her voice was clear.
"I am not a woman in need of rescue.
I am not a wound looking for a remedy. I am someone who made a clear decision, last night, alone, and I am standing in this garden because of that decision, not because of anything else." Edmund said nothing. "And if you are standing here," she continued, "it needs to mean something real, not proximity. Not the intimacy of shared secrets and 3 dances and a library on a winter afternoon. Something that has considered itself clearly and arrived here deliberately. Because I will not rebuild a future inside someone else's half-formed intention. I did that once. I know what it costs." She stopped. The garden was very quiet. A bird landed briefly in the bare branches above them and departed. The frost held its silence underfoot. Edmund looked at her, with nothing managed, nothing constructed. What was there instead was simply him, the man underneath the duke, unguarded, serious, looking at her with an attention so complete it took effort not to look away. Then he closed the distance between them, not quickly, not with urgency, but with the deliberate certainty of a man entirely committed to every step. He stopped close enough that she had to lift her chin to hold his gaze. He did not touch her, not yet. "I crossed a room," he said, "toward a woman I did not know, for no reason I could have articulated to anyone, including myself." His voice was low, even. "I have spent 10 days in her company, in reception halls and winter gardens and a library, and every conversation has confirmed what the first 10 seconds confirmed, that she is the most genuinely interesting person I have encountered in longer than I intend to admit, and that being in a room with her is where I want to be." Georgia held his gaze. "I am not here out of sympathy." Something shifted in his expression, the last layer of it setting aside, revealing something simply, plainly true underneath. "I am here because 10 days ago I crossed a room, and I have not, in any meaningful sense, stopped crossing it. The frost, the bare branches, the pewter sky." Georgia felt something in her chest, held in careful, costly compression for 11 months. Release, quietly, the way things release when the holding is finally no longer necessary. She thought about the wedding, the untouched champagne, sitting at the edge of a blazing celebration with her hands folded, convinced this was as much as the future had to offer her. Then she thought about a hand extended, palm up, in the candlelight. She stepped forward, into the remaining distance, and kissed him. Not the library. The library had been warmth and privacy and old books. This was cold, open air, full daylight, nothing to soften it, and nothing to excuse it. Entirely, unambiguously deliberate. His hands came to her face, warm through his gloves, cupping her jaw with a tenderness so precise it made her breath catch. He kissed her back with the same unhurried attention he brought to everything, as though she were worth taking his time over. When she drew back, they were both very still. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen, open, serious, and beneath the seriousness, something very close to wonder. Was that the decision you made last night? Part of it? And the rest? She held his gaze, and then she laughed. Genuine, unguarded, completely unperformed. It changed her whole face. Edmund's expression shifted into something unmistakably, slightly undone by the sound of it. I have not heard you laugh before. No, Georgia agreed, composing herself. Barely. You haven't. Was that a yes? She looked at the man who had crossed a room without deciding to, and had not, in 10 days, found a reason to regret it. Who had offered her honesty when everyone else offered management? It was a beginning, she said, and extended her hand. Edmund took it, not with the formal courtesy of propriety, but with the warm, certain grip of a man who intends to keep it, and said nothing at all. Which was, Georgia understood, his version of everything. Spring had arrived at Harwick House without announcement. It had simply appeared, tentatively, as though unsure of its welcome after the long grey insistence of winter. The hedgerows along the east garden showed the first pale suggestion of green. The ornamental trees that had stood bare against the pewter sky all through January and February had quietly, overnight, changed their minds. The light through the library windows was warmer now, arriving at a different angle and staying longer. Georgia noticed these things. She had always noticed things. She stood at the tall library window with tea she had forgotten to drink, watching Edmund in the east garden below. He had taken his correspondence outside, a small concession to the season he would not have described as such. Jacket discarded, cravat loosened by precisely the amount that indicated genuine ease. Papers arranged with the orderliness of a man who could not entirely suspend his own nature, even in a spring garden. She watched him read, turn a page, make a note in the margin of something, not with the anxious cataloguing attention she had once applied to the people around her, measuring expressions for the next thing she would need to absorb without showing it, simply watching. The uncomplicated pleasure of observing someone you know well doing something ordinary. This was what no one had told her about happiness, not the grand version, not the declaration in the East Garden or the library, or the 3 dances in a candlelit reception hall. What she had not anticipated was this, the Tuesday morning version, with forgotten tea, and a man reading correspondence, and spring light moving through tall windows at an angle that was simply, unargumentably, correct. 6 weeks she had been at Harwick House. The wedding had been in January. The life she was living bore no resemblance to any life she had previously imagined, which was, she had concluded, entirely the point. The imagined life was the one that had been taken from her. This one had not been imagined. It had simply arrived, through 10 days of untouched champagne and honest conversation, and a hand extended palm up in candlelight. She thought about Cecily occasionally, not with bitterness. That had run its season. Cecily had written in February a letter of genuine warmth that had taken Georgia several readings to fully receive. She had written back. It was not what it had been, but it was something, a thread maintained across a complicated distance, which was the honest version of what a sister could be after everything. Arthur she did not think about at all. Below in the garden, Edmund set down his pen. He looked up, not searching, not checking whether he was observed, simply looked up the way a person does when the quality of the morning has shifted without yet resolving into a specific cause. His gaze found the library window, found her. Georgia did not move back from the glass, simply the face of a woman standing at a window in her own library, watching the person she intended to spend her life with. Something in Edmund's expression shifted. That particular quality she had learned to recognize, the one that appeared briefly before his composure recovered it, except it appeared more often now, and his composure was in less of a hurry to recover it. She understood that this was what it looked like when a man who had spent a long time being very controlled discovered he did not particularly want to be. The corner of his mouth moved, barely, unmistakably, and he returned to his correspondence. Georgia turned back to the room. Their library, dark walnut shelves, annotated volumes, The reading table where the Herschel still sat with its margins full of questions asked by a man reading carefully alone, before a winter afternoon when someone else found them and understood without explanation what they meant about him. She had added her own annotations, a different hand, smaller, occasionally arguing with his in the margins with a precision he had described as aggressive, and she had described as thorough. That marginal dialogue had become, over 6 weeks, a conversation she looked forward to, with the same quiet pleasure she looked forward to most things that were simply, ordinarily, part of this life. She sat, picked up her book, then looked up, the way you look up when something in your interior landscape demands a moment of acknowledgement. She thought about January, a reception hall blazing with celebration, a champagne glass untouched, her hands folded in her lap with the costly composure of a woman holding herself together by will alone, the doors opening, a man crossing a room without knowing why, a hand extended, palm up, in the candlelight. The memory arrived without weight, without the layered grief that had accompanied it for so long. That grief had done its work and departed, the way things do when they have been honestly felt rather than managed. What remained was simply the memory itself, a candle-lit room, a hand, a woman who said yes, not because she wanted to dance, but because sitting still one more moment might have actually undone her. Georgia set it down gently, the way you set down something you have carried a long time and no longer need to carry, and returned to her book. Below in the east garden, Edmund turned a page. The spring light moved through the library windows and lay itself across the Turkish rug and the shelves of annotated books with the unhurried warmth of something that has arrived and intends, this time, to stay. Thank you for watching until the final page. Every duke, every duchess, every quiet heartbreak, every romance, they only live because you're here listening. Like, comment, and subscribe so you never miss the next one.